Alhamdulillah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Praise be to God. I bear witness that there is no God but God, and He has no partners. Inshallah, today in the first khutbah, we will look at what the Quran speaks about righteousness. We know that righteousness is not an external attribute. What you see outside in a person or in a group or in a community or individual's race, that is not righteousness. Righteousness is something internal. It is the state of your mind. If you have a state of mind that is inclined towards righteousness, that's when you become righteous. Your act necessarily, although may appear as righteous, may not be righteous. So righteousness is something that is internal to you. So when we attempt to become righteous in our conduct as believers, the first thing we need to do is look within ourselves and see what's within our hearts. A person who's not righteous in his heart, in his or her heart, is not righteous at all. So your righteousness comes from within your heart, your soul, the state of your soul. If the state of your soul is corrupt, no matter what you do, you may be giving charity to someone, you may be feeding the poor, you may be doing your salah, you may be doing everything, but you're still not righteous. That's the reason why in the Quran there is a concept of nullification of your righteous deeds. Why? How does it nullify? It's because your internal state is not of a righteous person. There is the righteous deed and the nullification of the righteous deeds. The nullification exists because your internal state is corrupt. So righteousness begins from within you, from within your soul, the state of your soul. So if you decide, I'm going to be righteous, the first thing most people think is, I need to give more charity, I need to do my prayers, I need to do this, and I need to do that. That's not the first thing that you need to think if you're trying to purify yourself and become righteous. Look within yourselves and see what is the state of your mind. So if the state of your mind is in a state of total submission to God, and there is a sincere desire within you to become a good person, and a sincere desire within you to know the truth, a sincere desire to help others, to serve others, without any selfless needs. You don't have any ulterior motives. Your motive is simply to serve others, to please God, ultimately please God. If this is your state of mind, that means you are in a state of righteousness. Now it's all about, increasing in your righteousness. So that's why God gives us different spiritual practices, certain commandments to increase in our righteousness. So that is why in many verses in the Quran you will see God saying, do this and this, but make sure you have righteousness. When it speaks about Hajj, it says take all the provisions before you go for Hajj, but the best provision you can take is the provision of righteousness. Why? Because without that, no matter what you take with you during Hajj, you put your ihram, you do this, you carry a lot of stuff, and you prepare, you book the finest hotels near Mecca, with a view to the haram, and you feel like, what a wonderful Hajj I have. I have all my people, you take all your relatives and everything. But if you don't take the most important provision, which is righteousness, sincerity in your heart and devotion to God, your Hajj is zero. So that's why God says the most important provision that you need to take with you when you go for Hajj is righteousness. So righteousness begins with your internal state. So and God commands us to be righteous. So how do we become righteous? The first thing is look within yourselves. In Surah 2 verse 148, God says, each of you chooses the direction to follow, you shall race towards righteousness. Wherever you may be, God will summon you. All God is omnipotent. So here God commands us that we have to race toward righteousness. We have to have that eagerness to go towards righteousness. And again, it's not about what you're doing. A lot of people are competing against each other He gave 500, I will give 1,000. Oh, he built one house for a poor person, I'm going to build two houses for a. This is an ego competition. It's not competing in righteousness. You see? But someone looking from the outside will see, oh, they're competing against each other to become more righteous. But essentially, that's not what's happening. What's happening is these people are in an eagerness to feel good about themselves. They're competing against each other to pander their ego, basically. So that's why I said, what is righteousness? Righteousness is something within yourself. It's a selfless act. All activities that you do as a righteous person is not there's nothing for you there. It's all for others, and it's all primarily for God. That's why in Surah 2 verse 177 God says, righteousness is not turning your face towards the east or the west. So what does God mean by that? Why is God speaking about turning your face east and west? When you turn your face east and west, what are you doing? It's a physical act. You're moving your head towards the east and right. It's a physical act. It's an exterior thing. If I ask you to move your head to the east and west, you will turn like this. But God says that that's not righteousness, which means what do you do externally is not what constitutes righteousness. Then God goes on to explain what righteousness is. Righteous are those who believe in God. See, that's very important. Immediately God goes into your heart, which means belief is what makes you righteous, which means it's an internal state. It's not what you do on the exterior world. You may be doing a lot of charity, you might do a lot of things, building this, building that. But God says those acts are not righteousness. Righteousness begins with belief. So which means it's an internal state. It's what is within you. It's not what's outside you. Those who believe in God, that's the first thing. The last day, the angels, the scripture, and the prophets, and they give money cheerfully. Again, God is saying, not giving money just like that. It's not the act, cheerfully, which means you have your mindset is you are happy to give it. See, again, God is emphasizing on your internal state, what's in your heart. It's not, God could have simply said giving charity, but He said giving charity cheerfully, which means there's happiness in you. When you give that charity to someone, you're happy. Why? Because you're changing someone's life. You're supporting them. You're doing a righteous act. You're making someone better. And while you're doing it, you don't get anything out of it. If I give some poor person somewhere some money, I don't get anything out of it. I actually, if I speak in financial terms, my bank balance is reduced a little bit. But if I'm giving it cheerfully with happiness, I'm thinking that's an investment. God says it's a loan of righteousness. It's an investment which God will return multifold, and that's God's promise in the Quran. So if you believe that, if your belief is in the right place, you will be happy to invest. If you know, you invest in many things, right? When you invest in many things, if you're sure you're going to get 3 times more money, are you going to invest? You will invest. So similarly, if you have a strong belief that what you do in the cause of God is going to be returned to you multifold, you will cheerfully, you will look for ways and places where you can spend your money in the cause of God. So that's why God says cheerfully, to the relatives, to the orphans, to the needy, the traveling alien, the beggars, and to free the slaves. And they observe the contact prayers and give the obligatory charity, and they keep their word. See, these are all about your mental state. The keeping your word. When you make a promise, you keep your word. Why? Because you believe that you have made a commitment to someone. You have to make sure that it is delivered. That you try your best to make sure that it's delivered. You made a commitment and you stick to it. Whenever they make a promise and they steadfastly persevere in the face of persecution. So when tough situations happen, what do? They have sabr, or they have perseverance. They're steadfast. Hardship and war. These are the truthful, these are the righteous. So in these verses, what you see is God is completely speaking about your emotional, mental state. He's not talking about how many times you are bowing, how many times you are prostrating, how many amount of money you gave here, how many buildings you built in for this person or that person. It's talking all about your emotion, what's inside your heart. And that begins with the belief in God, doing righteous works like charity, etc., giving to the relatives, orphans, etc., cheerfully, happily. And you're freeing the slaves. And you're observing the contact prayers, giving the zakat, keeping your word whenever you make a promise, and also having sabr or patience and being steadfast during hardship and war. God says these are the truthful. So these are the people who are truly righteous. They are the righteous people because their righteousness comes from within their hearts. It's not something external. It has nothing to do with external things. It's everything within their hearts. And I was speaking about Hajj. God says in Surah 2, verse 197, Hajj is a ritual practice. You go for, it's a spiritual practice. It's one of the most critical or very much a practice that gives immense spiritual development for a believer. So whoever is able to go for that, we go for that. And in that context, God says in Surah 2, verse 197, Hajj shall be observed in the specified months. Whoever sets out to observe Hajj shall refrain from sexual intercourse, misconduct, and arguments throughout Hajj. Whatever good you do, God is fully aware thereof. Very critical part of the verse is, as you prepare your provisions for the journey, the best provision is righteousness. Make sure you take whatever you take along with your for Hajj, whatever provisions you take, make sure you take the provision of righteousness. You shall observe me, O you who possess intelligence. And God says in Surah 2, verse 201, that the prayer of the believers, there's an example. Others would say, our Lord, grant us righteousness in this world and righteousness in the hereafter, and spare us the retribution of hell. So the source of our righteousness, how can we become righteous? Again, it's something internal, but we will only attain that righteousness with God, through God. Without His help, you will never attain righteousness. If you want to spiritually advance yourself to a point where you become selfless giver, you're happy and cheerful to give charity to others. You're not concerned about what you get out of it. You're more concerned about what others get out of it. For you to reach that state, you need God's help. Without God's help, you cannot. You see, in many groups, there is this advocacy of many atheists and humanists and all those people who are also giving charity to people, who are also building structures and feeding this person and that person and contributing to the World Food Program and all those things. But they lack the fundamental source of righteousness, which is God. They don't believe in a creator. So it's all for their ego. It's for them to feel good about themselves. I'm doing this great thing, so I feel good. Well, it's not for you to feel good. It's to make sure that someone else is benefiting from it. So that's the real righteousness. The righteousness is not about proving a point. It's not about feeling good about yourself. It's all about doing something selflessly. Nothing for you, but for others. That's why we see a verse in the Quran where the believer says, we do not even expect a thank you from you. When they give something, they don't expect even a thank you from others. So unless and until we reach that level where we expect nothing and give selflessly, we are not righteous. In many instances where God speaks about our rights within the Quran, there is an emphasis on maintaining righteousness. You have to be righteous. God gives you certain rights and you're only liable for it, or you only deserve it if you're righteous. For example, in Surah 2, verse 223, God says, your women are the bearers of your seed, thus you may enjoy this privilege however you like, so long as you maintain righteousness. So there is a condition. It's not, God giving you something, it's like you can use and abuse in any way you want. Even the spouses that you have, God gives you spouses. It's not something that you can use and abuse and treat them any way you want. God says that you have rights over them only if you maintain righteousness, so long as you maintain righteousness. So if you're a tyrant, you have no right over your spouse. You lose your rights as far as God is concerned. So you may enjoy this privilege however you like, so long as you maintain righteousness. You shall observe God and know that you will meet Him, give good news to the believers. And also in cases of divorce also, God again advocates righteousness, forfeiting things, giving up, being selfless. For example, in the case, these are examples of what righteousness means. For example, in Surah 2, verse 237, God says, if you divorce them before touching them, but after you had set the dowry for them, the compensation shall be half the dowry, unless they voluntarily forfeit their rights, or the party responsible for causing the divorce chooses to forfeit the dowry. To forfeit is closer to righteousness. You shall maintain the amicable relations among you. God is seer of everything you do. So God is telling you to give it up, to forfeit. You see? So why God is teaching us this? Because being selfless, you're very greedy. You want to get everything back, and you don't want to give anything away. This is the nature of the ego. The ego wants to keep everything, but being righteous means you're letting it go. And again in Surah 2 verse 240, God says, those who die and leave wives, a will shall provide their wives with support for a year, provided they stay within the same household. If they leave, you commit no sin. If they leave, you commit no sin by letting them do whatever they wish, so long as righteousness is maintained. God is Almighty, most wise. And in Surah 2 verse 245, God says, who would lend God a loan of righteousness, to have it repaid to them multiplied manifold? God is the one who provides and withholds, and to Him you will be returned. So here God says that advocates righteousness, that you should lend a loan of righteousness to have it repaid to you multiplied and manifold. So that's the whole idea. Why should we be righteous? What encourages us to be righteous? God says that He will multiply it back to us. So it's in our best interest to be righteous. If we are a righteous person, God says whatever act you do, He will return it back to you multiplied. In Surah 3 verse 92, God says, you cannot attain righteousness until you give to charity from the possessions you love. Most people give charity from whatever is left behind. I'm not using any of these stuff, so maybe you can take it. That's not charity. Charity is something that you give out of something that you value, you love. For example, money. Everybody likes money. So it's something that you value, but you still give it away. Then that's charity. If you're having a bunch of clothes that you've not been using for the past 5 years and it's sitting and rotting, and some poor man comes and you say, okay, you can take this. That's not charity. I used to believe that it was charity, but after reading this verse, I understood that it's not charity. Charity is something that you give out of something you love. So again, God is teaching you that you have to give up on something that you want to keep. That's righteousness. So it's again something that's within your heart. Whatever you give to charity, God is fully aware thereof. So these verses teach us what righteousness is. It's a state of your mind. Without righteousness coming from within, you have no righteousness at all. Whatever deeds you do, it is not accepted. Tubu Allah rabbi. Alhamdulillah, shadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika la. Praise be to God. I bear witness that there is no God but God, and He has no partners. Now the opposite side of righteousness is the nullification of your works. There are certain things that if you do, it nullifies. your works, your righteous deeds. And what is that? It's when your internal state is corrupted. So if you give charity with an ulterior motive of controlling the person, I will give, I know he has needs now, I will give him something so that later on, when I need something, I will get it from this person. I will make them work for me. Or you give some charity to someone to get let's say you're a politician, you're giving charity work to make sure you win the next election. You go out to give all the poor people rice and everything. They do this because he knows that 1 year down the line an election is coming, so I have to win. So right now I'll do some social work. They call it social work, but it's not social work. According to God, it's a waste of time, because you're not doing it for your soul. You're not doing it for the cause of God. You're expecting something in return. So when that's your motive, according to God, it's not a righteous deed at all, because your internal state is not changed. Right? You're buying something. It's a trade rather than charity. So what happens to those works? God says nullified, zero. That's what we see in many, many verses. God says in Surah 3 verse 22, their works have been nullified both in this life and in the hereafter, and they will have no helpers. This is about the disbelievers. Because whatever they've been doing, no matter how good it was, because their internal state, their belief if they had no belief and they've moved into disbelief, everything is nullified. Automatically, that exposes your insincerity in everything you did. Surah 5 verse 53, God says, the believers will then say, are these the same people who swore by God solemnly that they were with you? Their works have been nullified, they are the losers. This is talking about people who betrayed the believers. They betrayed the believers. Why? Because their internal state, the state of their belief was corrupt. So, when the time came, they betrayed the believers. So the believers said, are these the same people who swore by God? They even took the name of God. But see, this is why I'm saying, you can say anything you want, you can do anything you want. It's an external activity, right? Whatever you speak with your mouth, you can say, Wallahi, Allahi, you're swearing by using the name of God, but nothing is happening here. So what happens? When the time comes, they will betray you. But they said all the sweet things. They said all the beautiful words. By God, we will do this. Inshallah, I will do this. But they don't do anything. They have no sincerity. And they will swear by God also, I will do this. But when the time comes, they betray the believers. And God says their works have been nullified. They are the losers. God says idolatry is also a thing that nullifies your righteous acts. Surah 6 verse 88, God says, such is God's guidance with which He guides whomever He chooses from among His servants. Had any of them fallen into idolatry, their works would have been nullified. So why is idolatry nullifying all your deeds? Because this corrupts your internal state, your mind. Your righteous deeds are only counted as righteous deeds if it is solely to please God. You should not have another God. If you're doing something to please God and the people and the society and your parents and your siblings and your group and your community, you have an ulterior motive to make sure that people respect me. You're a dead duck. It means you're worshipping your ego. You have another idol with God. One, God, the other is you and your ego. And that means you're committing idol worship. You're worshipping yourself. So in that case, God says your works had any of them fallen into idolatry, their works would have been nullified. So every righteous act that you do has to be selfless. You expect nothing in return. Zero. You just expect only from God. Nothing in return. Thus the truth prevailed, and this is in Surah 718, and what they did was nullified. This is talking about the disbelievers. All their works will be nullified. Then rejection of God's message also leads to nullification of your righteous acts. If you are a sincere person, you will not reject God's revelations. In Surah 7 verse 147, God says, those who reject our revelations and the meeting of the hereafter, their works are nullified. Are they requited only for what they committed? This is talking, for example, atheists and the humanists. They reject God's revelations. They don't even believe that they will be held responsible on the day of judgment. They don't believe in a day of judgment. But they're doing all these charity work, and we are doing this to give this to the poor people and that people. But God says, if you don't believe in any of these things, it's all zero, nullified. Surah 11 verse 16, God says, it is they who gave up their share in the hereafter, and consequently hell is their lot. All their works are in vain. Everything they have done is nullified. In Surah 33 verse 19, God says, also they are too stingy when dealing with you. If anything threatens the community, you see their eyes rolling with fear, as if death had already come to them. Once the crisis is over, they whip you with sharp tongues. They are too stingy with their wealth. These are not believers, and consequently, God has nullified their works. This is easy for God to do. So this is talking about the hypocrites who they are very stingy when they are dealing with you. If anything threatens the community, you see their eyes rolling with fear. So again, this is exposing, these situations are exposing their internal state. They have no concern for the community. They are not going to help the community. But when something goes wrong, they are afraid and they want to run away. And once the crisis is over, they whip you with sharp tongues. They whip you means they hurt you. They will say, you should have done this, you should have done that. Why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you do it that way? We barely got out of the situation. So instead of being empathetic, they will whip you with their sharp tongues. They are too stingy with their wealth. These are not believers. So again, because their internal state is not that of a righteous person, God says they are not believers, and all their works, whatever they did while they were in the community or with the believers, are all nullified. In Surah 47 verse 28, God says, this is because they followed what angered God and hated the things that please Him. Consequently, He has nullified their works. So here, what we see again, finally, is God saying that they followed these people who are not righteous. They followed what angered God. No matter what they were saying, what they were doing, whatever righteous acts they may have appeared to be doing, they were following things that did not please God. They angered God and hated the things that please Him. And they hated things that please Him. So ultimately, all your righteous acts should be directed towards pleasing God and Him alone. So if you're doing, no matter what you're doing, what you're following, what kind of religion you're following, if it is not what pleases God, and if it is something that angers God, all your works are nullified. So from these verses, it's very clear that righteousness is something that comes from within your heart. It's not something that you do externally. It's not how many things. If someone says, oh, this person is a righteous person, if you are a believer, you know what the Quran says, you will look into the heart of the person and how sincere they are. You will not be impressed by what they're doing in the exterior, because you know what the Quran says. The Quran says it's not what they it's not turning the head to the east or the west, your face to the east or west. It's your belief in God and many other things that is explained in that verse. So may God guide us and help us in attaining righteousness, sincere righteousness that is rooted in worshipping God alone. Aqimus salam.